Good morning again, and thank you very much for letting me share a few thoughts with you this morning. The title of this discussion is The Value of a Woman, but in order for us to really talk about the value of a woman, we have to think about how we value, period. So I'm going to just start off with some basic questions for you, and maybe you'll have some comments later on. How do you make your purchasing decisions? How do you determine who's valuable in your life? In many ways, we say that money is a source and the basis of commerce. It's a medium of exchange that allows us to facilitate the things that we wish we have, or want to have, I should say. But money is also the means by which we value people. Those of you who have children or grandchildren in college, the first thing that people ask is, what is their major? If they were to say philosophy, the first thing they're going to see is probably a drooping face on the part of the person asking. Or if they say art history, the same thing. Why? Because the default is what kind of income are they going to be able to generate? And this is a really important point because it underlies almost everything we do, consciously or unconsciously. The medium of exchange that we use to facilitate, hopefully, making our lives a little easier from transactions without having to look for bartering partners, has also become the means by which we value each other. And I hope that you'll think about this as I offer just a few comments to you. And I know the first comment that someone could have, because I try to think of a couple of these, would be, well, if it's not money, then how do we value things? Well, the question I have for you is, first of all, we live in a social construction. As I was driving to Chatham this morning, I drove by another church, and it said, or actually the middle school, because I was on Commerce Road, and it said, you become what you believe. The same thing goes with our economic system, or any system that we live in that's socially constructed. It becomes what we believe it can. So we have devolved to a system where monetary means are the primary basis of evaluating and valuing everything. But that's because we've blindly partaken in that. So in the responsive reading, it was that we were basically being present for our discussion today. I want you to think about how you're so busy every day of your life that you aren't present, that snap judgments and defaults on how things can operate or should operate become your method of operation. How we interact with perhaps 100 people a day, depending upon whether we go shopping that day or just walk down the street, and how few of them do we actually understand or know. Yet we already have formulated an opinion of them based on some sort of physical aspect of who they are or how they have chosen to speak with you. So the first thing I ask my students, especially right around the time when they're going to be evaluating me for the course, is to think, do you want to be evaluated based on a cross-section of time or based on who you are over time? I would bet almost all of us would say we want to be evaluated based on who we are over time, which means for those people that meet us at cross-sections of time, we want the benefit of the doubt that we are better than what they think, right? But in general, we are so busy and we have learned to see the world as black and white that we don't allow ourselves to be in that area of gray that we ourselves wish to be judged. So this is the premise and the discussion, hopefully foundation for us today. And there are a couple of things I wanted to point out. I hope that you'll find some meaning in some of the things I've said, hopefully some thought-provoking elements. What I learned a long time ago, and I used to go to First Parish Brewster when Mary and J.D. were the ministers. One time, J.D. said in her sermon, in an hour you will not remember 90% of what I've said, but you will remember what I made you feel. So I have used that basis in terms of any interaction I have with people, hopefully to pass on a positive feeling that leaves you with something to think about for a longer period of time. In order for us to be the person or the world that we want to be, we have to be patient, but also recognize that it's in our own belief that that can happen, that it actually starts to happen. And it really makes sense. It sounds so abstract when you first think about it, But when you start to live your life as though the changes you already want have been made, that in and of itself makes those changes occur. So I have a couple of things I'd like to share with you. First, I asked you how you make your decisions. I would imagine the majority of you are going to say you make your decisions based on price to some extent. I'm sure that all of you probably have something in your closet at some point in time that you purchased, may even have the tag still on it, that you've never really worn or don't have any desire to wear because it was just bought on impulse. You probably don't feel guilty about it either. And this is actually a component of what I want to share with you when it comes to the value of a woman. What we value things based on, which is primarily dollars and income or a perception of those, determines our sense of responsibility towards them. So perhaps we've been going about the value of a woman a little in an odd way. So I'll share that in a second because I want to build up to that in a moment. So all this time, when we look at prices and what we're easily able to dispose of, it's because it didn't cost enough, right? The whole idea of what we value has to do with how much was it relative to our budget, or why we continue to keep it is because the price of it is a sunk cost that we're not willing to walk away from. It's a dollars and cents issue. But what do you value the most? These flowers were in dedication to both my parents, who I've lost now over the last 11 years. I can honestly say, and it's so sad, because our finiteness and mortality make it this challenging, but I recognize their value to me more now than I did when they were alive. And I'm sure that that's true for most of us. But they didn't cost anything, did they? So this is what I'm hoping we will talk about in just a minute. So I just want to share a couple other things with you first. When we think about equity and the value of a woman, typically what ends up being the discussion point is how much women make relative to men, right? We hear this all the time. I want to challenge that discussion point and ask you to do something else, which also then ties back to what I said initially, which is we live in a socially constructed system which can be changed because it didn't descend from the heavens, even though we are in a religious building. So when we look at pay equity, what it really tells us is how many women are in occupations held predominantly by men. So therefore, the average income becomes closer and closer to that of men's income. But what we're not talking about is why not how many men are in traditionally female occupations? Because that's another way of also achieving equity. And why is it that that's the case? Because we, again, as I mentioned and you all agreed with, look at income as the barometer of value. So if income is the barometer of value, that means only the things that the market can value become the determinants of your value. So when we cease to work, we have less income, so we become less valuable. Now, I brought up my parents, and I told you with teary eyes, which is always the case whenever we think of the people we've lost in our lives, and we think about how small our family truly is when that happens. I said to you that they were priceless to me. How has the word priceless become synonymous with valueless? Women have been put in gender roles very similar to how we've looked at caste, looking at from a racial or ethnic perspective. So women have been cast in a specific role that our gender, on a traditional basis, limited our ability to transition out of. Caste in and of itself is not necessarily a negative element, is it? It just means you're born into a specific occupation and you have specific roles. The challenge becomes when those specific roles don't confer any value to you. So as we've monetized our economy, we have made these priceless roles based on market transactions valueless. Does that make sense to you? Have you thought about it this way before? Okay, so stay with me. So children are a traditional role. Only one gender can procreate, at least so far. Who knows what science can bring. But at this moment, that is the case. There are many reasons why women have become subordinate to men on a global basis, but more than likely it is somewhat tied to colonization to a large extent and the exportation of Christian gender roles across the world based on that colonization. Unfortunately, we can't really go back that well because of many different reasons, but irrespective, the gender roles that existed didn't exist to subordinate women, but to ensure familial creation. And even our government, up until the 1970s, also used regulations to reinforce that by limiting women's freedoms to do many things, including having a credit card. The limitation was a forced mechanism to keep people in their position, but what it failed to do was also incentivize everyone to understand the value of that position. Simultaneously, to maintaining a woman's position was not an education about the significance of her role. So this is one area where economics actually did a very negative thing in terms of gender roles. If we only look at income as the basis of a person's value, at least you could look at the child rearing value of the parent that stays home. So this is a question I typically ask in my classes. Are children familial or societal assets? So in this day and age, I would argue that children are societal assets because they live with you for some period of time, but then they go out in the world and they partake in it, become taxpayers, and provide value to society, hopefully. So who has invested in order to be able to make that child a positive, what we'd call a positive externality to society? It is whoever raised the child. So here's the conundrum. When we value people based only on their income, the caregiver, the parent, is forced to determine whether they want to be valued in societal ways and therefore outsource the child rearing to someone else and make an income, even though on the margin they probably aren't making that much of an income because they have to pay someone to take care of their child, or to stay at home and take care of their child and be valued very little by society for doing so. The other part is over time that child has value to society because it becomes the basis of the tax base, if nothing else, for everyone else. Their positive interactions with other people also benefit us all. So the short-sightedness of making our decisions on what is valuable and what's not valuable and when and why is perhaps the biggest challenge we have to ask ourselves. Why aren't we looking at things from a longer time perspective? It's only when you look at things from a longer time perspective that you will also make better decisions, as we all have done in our own lives. When you make quick decisions, oftentimes they fail to meet the needs in the future. So the few points that I just hoping to make to you, and I'm going to share a couple other thoughts before I conclude, is that, first of all, a simple example of caregiving is the child-rearing component. And parents, based on research, are probably the best able to provide quality childcare to their children. But since it's not an income-based system, child-rearing, that priceless activity is rendered valueless in a system that only looks at dollars and cents. Women could have traditional roles, very much like the traditional roles that people from the country of my origin have at birth, based on what caste you were born into. But it only works if you value each one of those levels. If you think somehow one level, because of its power, has superiority over the other, then you diminish the value of that. And perhaps that's what we need to challenge. And ultimately, the way to challenge it is not to look at women's parity by women becoming more like men, but perhaps maybe both men and women finding where they wish to be based on what they value for themselves. So you have equity based on distribution of men and women across occupational groups, rather than increased occupational perception of women and male-dominated areas. This is not a very challenging idea, in my opinion, but it will be challenged because of one simple reason. We all need money in order to live. So the question I brought up to you earlier is, can we change our economic system? We are going to have a smaller population as we move forward. Is there a way that we can, through our tax basis, value people in a way that the market doesn't? Because you can't make money out of staying home and taking care of your child, though that will be monetized longer term. So is there a way that we can educate the population to understand that longer term, these individuals will be important components of society, and therefore we can value the parenting component to incentivize it positively? Because just having a child but not having financial means to take care of the child is not going to provide that positive externality for that person who they're going to be in the future. When you have financial challenge, it can create a lot of disharmony in a home and perhaps cause more adverse consequences for who that child will end up being. So you can see that in order for us to actually move from a priceless to a value-full society, we need to engage with the longer-term applications of everything that we put in place. We have to understand that, yes, it may be expensive to raise children, even though our children have been raised. It may be challenging to think about welfare changes, even though we ourselves have never partaken of those elements of transfer payments to us. But in the long run, our economic system will thrive. Now, economic systems, for most people, they think of it as this idea of growth. What I mean by an economic system, and please know that there is no standard definition for an economic system, is what we live in every day at the local level. How do you feel when you walk into a store and people are friendly to you, relative to walking into a store and people are not paying attention, not connecting to you? How does that make you feel, and how likely are you to go back? That's what makes an economic system thrive. It's not the prices we pay and the discomfort of interaction. It's the interaction that we have that makes us want to pay the prices that we pay. So we've got it a little backwards there too. So think about the places that you frequent. I would bet you maybe sometimes you pay more than you could somewhere else, but you like the way they treat you. This is yet another example of that element of pricelessness that we don't put value on. And it may be declining because of it. When you go to your local stores and you deal with people who are in your communities, how does that affect everyone? Now, the challenge here, and the challenge also related to other comments I've made, is population size. As we become larger populations, it becomes much easier to hide behind our anonymity. So this is yet another reason why busyness, which I mentioned earlier, perhaps needs to stop, so that we don't have anonymity, so that we do know who we are interacting with. We can see the value that that one smile brings. We can see how that has a ripple effect through the day for that one individual that could have a tremendous ripple effect through a community. I don't know how many of you think about that, how the passage of just a smile, but for some people that one interaction may be all they have. So things have much more significance. Those things are priceless, not valueless. So I hope that you'll think to yourselves as we move forward, how can we give value to those things that we need but don't pay for? How can we indirectly enhance their viability and their growth in our communities? Right now, I am very afraid of the decline that I see in these elements, especially in younger generations. They have not had the same amount of interface with people as we have in our life, because technology, for the most part, has only come in through this latter portion of our existence. It's been there since the beginning for them. One thing that my son said to me once, a few years ago, when we've been on the Cape since he was in 5th grade, is, "Mommy, I feel bad for when I get older, because when the older people are gone, no one's going to look at me in the eye anymore." These are valueless things in dollars and cents, but priceless things that make our day-to-day existence worthwhile. So 2 things I'd like to finally close with, and hopefully if you have any comments, I'm just trying to leave you with thoughts. Believe me, I can talk for a long time. This year, a woman was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. Her name is Claudia Golden. She's a Harvard economist. Now, economics has been dominated by a couple of schools of thought, especially for the last, 50 years, easily, if not a little longer than that. And most of this has been what has created people's perceptions of what economics is. I want you to just take 2 things here from me. One, economists make up theories based on how they perceive the world's interactions. So if you have leading economists coming from the same thought process, their perception of how the world operates may be far from the reality of how it operates, and they may only be familiar with one social strata of that operation. Not all of us work in the world where we just look for immediate gratification. Many of us, based on just your facial expressions, live in that realm where we find value in the priceless. But through repeated teaching to us over generations that our gratification comes from shopping and buying, you have those items in your closet that you've never worn and don't feel guilty about. But also, we have distanced ourselves from the very things that we create, we get value from. So Claudia Golden won the Nobel Prize for her work on the gender gap, which follows from seminal work from a man named Gary Becker, who also won the Nobel Prize from the University of Chicago. And both of these individuals look at the same basic theory, which is that we seek to maximize our income because that is how we value our worth. We have been taught this. It's not something that we innately always had, and not everyone had in their life. In 1979, Jimmy Carter made a speech, sometimes called the Crisis of Confidence speech. What he noted very clearly within about around minute 15 or 20, I can't remember exactly, is that we've become a nation of consumers, basically. We get our value from things, no longer from people and friends and family. We are only thinking about things. So the reason why I'm bringing these things up to you is we've only been on this current economic system since the 1940s on a global scale, where we're thinking of production as being the basis of economic progress. I want you to think about how silly and ridiculous that is when you have landfills and incineration of things that will never naturally biodegrade, and that we have to constantly produce more and more even though we have a finite planet. So growth is the basis of our economy, although most people can't understand when you really sit back if you're not so busy. And you think back about it, why should growth be the basis of our economy? Why shouldn't you have things that you've kept for years? Why doesn't everybody have an iron skillet? So when we look at this idea of growth and constant growth that's been sold to us, we can start to understand maybe some of the other elements that also have been sold to us, that we need to maximize how much we have, how we've become dependent upon income to value each other and value ourselves, to feel less than because we don't make a specific dollar amount, to recognize that when we value people, if they've had a wrongful death, it's based on the present value of their future stream of earnings. That's how it is. These are elements I hope you'll think about. So I'll leave you with one last comment related to this. And then I'm going to go back to one more thing I want to say. But if I asked you to sacrifice any part of your body, the first and easiest one would probably be your pinky toe, right? It doesn't really do anything. But the moment it's gone, your body's still communicating with it. And that's the moment you'll realize what it did. That's what I mean by pricelessness and value. Everything has tremendous value. But when we let the market determine its value, it's not going to determine its value properly because we're looking at the things we get out of it, right? And some of those things can't be monetized. So going back to this idea of growth, perhaps it's our preoccupation with having the latest and greatest stuff that's keeping us from really understanding the value of the things we already have. Perhaps it's our busyness in trying to get that latest and greatest stuff that's also preempting our ability to understand what we already have. And perhaps even more so, it's the entrenchment of one particular point of view of how an economy should run that has affected us all in perceiving what gives value to our lives. So we come to a meeting house such as this, which is happening less and less these days. The rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, has been occurring for some time. People who say they are not religious but are spiritual, but don't belong to any kind of religious categorization, don't come into any kind of common communion. When we do this, we actually affect the way we value the world around us, because we have by default given our purpose of our existence to what the economic system says is our purpose for our existence, which is gratification that comes out of consumption. Accumulation that gives us a sense of who we are because of how much we have. When you come to places where you're in communion with others, the opportunity is there to think to yourself that what gives me purpose may be something much more significant, maybe the acceptance that I have from my peers, my cohorts, my neighbors, maybe the sense that I'm worth something and I'm seen, that I have value, irrespective of this may be my only social interaction for the day or the week. We don't get that when we go to the store. We don't get that with the amount of the things that we hoard. So the last comment I'm going to share with you is hopefully you will think about what is priceless and is that valueless, but also what is the purpose of being here? And have you just become a perfect economic agent where your purpose is tied directly to how much you have rather than who you are? We can change that based on just what we choose to be. So many people feel, especially young people, because I'm dealing with a lot of college students now, very stressed because they don't know what their job's going to be, what they're going to end up doing. That stress probably helps them, preempts them from actually getting to where they want to go because they can't hear what they really like or really what they want because it doesn't make enough money. We need people to do all kinds of labor, but we don't value all of it. So I will leave you with that comment. I hope that there was something of interest to you. And I guess we'll open it up to any comments or questions that any of you may have. Thank you. The mic.
Hi, my name is Susan Patterson. How would you apply the approach of creating an economic system or social construct that values the priceless to preserving our natural resources that are, public lands are opened up for logging and mining and destruction and plunder because governments value these corporations that make money off of them, but not enough people value public lands as a way to preserve these resources for the future and simply for their own inherent value, not for for any use that we may get out of them.
Well, the issue is complicated because we tend to make public policy based on a simple cookie cutter approach that you can just communicate one thing and it should fit everybody. So there are some people for whom there is a definite interest already in public land protection, so that's there. And you have other people who have never really interacted with nature, so have never understood its value. So for those, you probably need to get them some opportunity to go out. And the wonderful and beautiful thing is, I'm not mistaken, even in New York City, there are things called forest baths that are going on now, where they take people out into the forest so they can recognize the tranquility that being close to nature provides and hopefully enhance their value of it. But for those people who are also looking at it purely from a financial perspective, what we have to do is start to educate the population with one basic thing. We price goods and services basically, and all of you know this compounded rate formula because you've all done this. It's, you look to see what the value is of an investment at 10% in a year. You can all do that formula. Well, it's that interest rate, which is also the growth rate. So natural resources have a different growth rate than the financial markets do. But by default, we have often used the financial market growth rate for natural resources. So the other way to handle this is to talk about how climate change has affected natural resource regeneration rates and put a little risk in there. So if regeneration rates are 0, then the price today becomes higher. If regeneration rates are negative because of the risk of regenerating at the same level as in the past because things are changing, those products become even more expensive today. So let's look at one basic example that's really an oddity here. We go and fill up our gas tank, but petroleum products will never regenerate in any of our lifetimes. So the price that we're paying at the pump is far too low. It's based on that market demand and supply perception. There are a lot of anomalies like that. Helium balloons, for example, a few years ago, Party City closed about 45 of their stores, and many people didn't recognize why, but there's a helium shortage. But the price is not necessarily indicative of that shortage. So going back to the market price and my points about valuelessness and pricelessness, these are the issues, is that the market is only able to value what it has put in your mind as valuable. So I ask you to think about, how much of you in your decision making is autopilot in terms of even how you think about something as being valuable or not. But I would use a multi-pronged approach. One of the biggest failures of policy is a lack of understanding the different stakeholders that are involved. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh,
I think I could make it work without.
okay.
Oh, yeah.
Hybrid.
Thanks, Doctor. I wanted to say thank you in general for that. That was wonderful. But also that at the end, I really wanted to emphasize the idea that I really like that you put together with escaping this growth mindset that places value only on what the market tells us has value, and the connection that you had with us coming to communities, faith communities, or any kind of community rather than the sort of transaction-based experiences that we all have all the time, which because of the transaction are non-human in that way or humane. But it sounds like that the way of escaping that iterative cycle of the destructive growth mindset is, or the immediate gratification mindset, is to actually just to be together. And I really like that a lot.
Thank you very much. If I could add one comment there. Some of you may be interested in looking at a man named Paul Zak. You just look at his TED Talk. I don't recommend you buy all his books. He has 3 of them. He's a neuroeconomist, and it ties to your point right there. When we come together in a community, we supposedly release a hormone, oxytocin. It's the same thing that you get when you hug someone. It's also related to other things. It's a group mentality. It's the joy you get out of commonality. You can get it through negative as well as positive interactions, so it's not necessarily always related to something positive. But you can also get that same release through purchasing, gratification, some other external stimulus. So I really would like you to also think about this. We are drawn to purchase things because they make it enticing, giving us that hormonal release that we then seek to have. In other words, they found ways to make us addicted because we like that release. Almost everything we consume is tied to that. That's what I hope you'll sit back and think about. Think about all the decisions, the impulses, the desires, the cravings you have. And that will get to the bottom of what mindfulness is. We do not operate based on our own thinking patterns. I doubt most of us even know what we really think. Because we are so embedded with external bombardments all the time, and our busyness keeps us from thinking or critically engaging with them. None of us needed a cell phone. I was so happy when I got one. It was so big, but I thought, okay, now when I get a flat tire, if I ever got a flat tire, I'd be okay. I was in graduate school, and I felt very excited. Now none of us can be without one, right? It's the one thing you feel afraid of if you can't find it. What are you going to do? I even had an apartment building where I needed an app to get in. So I'm sharing this with you because that was perhaps at best a want for some of us, but now it has become a need. Yes. This is how marketing affects us. We live in a marketed demand economy. There is very little that you buy that you need. There is a lot that you buy that you want that then becomes a need to have. That is an addiction, isn't it? Think about the stimulation you feel and go through some withdrawal.
I'd like to thank you for coming today because I stayed home with my children for, well, I put it 20 years because I finally went back to work after 20 years. But, and when I tell people I stayed home, I feel guilty and I feel ashamed. So I really thank you because you made a value for it. So thank you.
No, thank you very much.
Yeah, you know, I lived in Boston for 22 years, and I would get on the bus and not a single person would look up. People would sit down on the bus with their back to me, right? And you go to the store and like, get out of my way, you're in my way again, right? Then I came to Cape Cod 10 years ago, and people actually smile. There is interaction when you do go to the store. And I value Cape Cod so dearly that this is where I want to be. So your lesson is true, okay?
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, yes, for today. I feel like I was supposed to be here. Don invited me, and everything you said, I was like, oh my goodness, I was supposed to hear that. And I think as a parent of a child in college, one of the things you were talking about, you know, my daughter's an art major, and people say, what is she going to do with that? And they've asked many, many times, and I just loved hearing you talk about it because I say, well, I don't know yet, and she doesn't know yet, but I can think about, you know, if she's not studying law or business or something, you know, people do look at you cockeyed and wonder, well, how will she ever survive? And it just reaffirmed for me, like, I cannot wait to see what she does, and who knows what she does, but she's an incredible human being that will be a contributor in some way. But it's a wonderful thing to hear you say that. It just gives me confidence in my reply, and not try to make excuses for what this wonderful child has decided to major in. And I can't wait, and I can't wait for you all to see what she does in this world, you know. So thank you for saying that. That was a beautiful part of what you were sharing with all of us.
If we can teach our children to live within their means, they'll always flourish. The problem is that if you're marketed to want more than your means, it's when you're challenged, right? The debt is what the issue is, and this consumerism is all about getting us trapped in debt. That's where growth comes from. So the US GDP, just to make this go all the way around, is about 70 to 75% based on consumer spending. on products that you're probably going to only use for a very little while and will be then landfilled and will never biodegrade. So one last comment, just to leave, and I'll get off the podium because I know that you all have other things to do today. Oikomenos is the word that economics comes out of. It was coined by Aristotle. It meant to manage the household, basically. Okay. People have a perception of what economics is, but you are born an economic agent and you die an economic agent. You live the economic theory. You know more about it than you realize. It's become more mathematical because it's making it more of a science. That's the only reason why. But math is only as good as the equation. So the variables that you put in the equation determine the value of that output. So just have more confidence in your own knowledge with regard to mastering how the economy works. And hopefully, if there's ever an opportunity, I'll give you a quick little study on how to look at least the Fed and the Federal Reserve's Federal Reserve's target rate. But that will be for another time. Have a great day.